So my thesis research at the University of Toronto's Faculty of Information is focused on information seeking and evaluation practices among Muslim converts in the Toronto area. And today I'll be focusing specifically on experiences of listening to embrace Islam. This connects with some of the other presentations this morning, so I hope that you'll all find something of use and relevance. So in my presentation today, I'll be presenting preliminary findings from my current research on how Muslim converts develop and present religious identities through the ways they seek, evaluate, and share information. Specifically, I'll be sharing highlights from my participant observation at local Muslim organizations and excerpts from my narrative interviews with converts to reflect on the role that listening plays in learning about Islam and in what it means to be Muslim. I draw from Tariq Ramadan's ideas about how knowledge is produced and identity is constructed and negotiated through intersecting religious texts and socio-cultural political contexts. As Ramadan points out, being Muslim involves not only an element of spiritual devotion, but also of education, action, and community participation. Earlier studies offer important precedents for exploring the relationships among new media, auditory engagement, and religious identity construction. For example, the work of Dale Eichelman and John Anderson and Heidi Campbell, as well as the anthropologist Charles Hirschkind. Additionally, existing literature on Muslim conversion in Europe and in North America suggests that listening can serve as a means of learning and expressing religious values and normative rhetorical patterns. My presentation today builds upon these theoretical and empirical insights and expands on the significance of listening for Muslim converts who are situated in a new media environment saturated with podcasts, spoken word poetry, and live stream lectures. My own reflections on Muslim converts' auditory participation in new media offer an opportunity for scholars of media, communication, information, religion, and culture to attend to everyday practices involved in learning about one's faith and transitioning to new religious communities. Furthermore, I hope that my observations attest to how the act of listening may support religious identity initiatives and foster effective interfaith dialogue. So before outlining findings from my own case study, I'd like to take a few moments to review existing literature. In the past decade, media scholars and anthropologists of religion have analyzed how Muslims in the Middle East, Africa, Europe, and North America use audio tapes, online lectures, and podcasts to articulate their faith, engage in dawah or religious invitation, and negotiate religious authority. Based on ethnographic fieldwork conducted in Egypt, Hirschkind identified cassette sermons as an acoustic medium that creates an environment to sustain Muslims' moral dispositions while embracing their full participation in the public sphere. Muslim preachers adopted media technologies to propagate their religious beliefs long before the internet became widely accessible. While neither oral communication nor printed texts have precluded each other in the Islamic Middle East, spoken word continues to carry, in the words of Amy Al-Alam, immense social and political power, especially in a religious setting, at least in appealing to popular religious sentiments. On a global scale, new media align with a traditional aversion to printed texts and an attraction to spoken dialogue within Islam. This is something that was addressed by Professor Sisler's work this morning. Moreover, many Islamic scholars and religious leaders continue to carefully follow guidelines on vocal rhythm, style, and intonation to study and recite the Quran and related commentaries, and to deliver sermons and other forms of preaching. In addition to research that connects new media with reverence for the oral transmission of religious knowledge in Islam, several scholars critique widespread misconceptions of Islam as a static tradition built around conservative authority figures by highlighting the dynamic ways that contemporary Muslims engage with Islamic religious materials. For instance, in post-colonial West Africa, as religious groups competed for government funding and airtime on public radio and television, audio cassettes, a form of what's also known as small media, and later the internet, offered effective alternatives for communicating religious perspectives. Audiovisual new media also provided affordances for non-state actors to publish their own agendas and challenge established authorities. In a similar way that the printing press during the 19th century mobilized Muslim scholars in the Middle East to challenge the ulama's influence, public radio and cassette tapes in the 20th century catalyzed a shift in how religious authority was distributed. As defined by Bruce Lawrence, authority in Islam includes three key nodes, each with their own contested narratives, namely the scriptural, the charismatic, and the juridical. That is to say, Islam maintains that the Quran is divine revelation. It invokes hadith, which recounts the Prophet Muhammad's words and deeds. And it builds upon a system of conduct, or sharia, and the ulama's advice regarding Muslim standards of ethics and behavior. Reflecting on Islamic authority, Lawrence asks, quote, who interprets the Quran and what makes one interpretation more valid than another? These questions are especially relevant when applied to the relationship between listening and learning, but what it means to be Muslim, as interpretation occurs through auditory practices as well as textual scholarship. With regard to Islamic websites and podcasts, scholars of religion and communication have examined how individual and collective meaning is produced and negotiated through online engagement. In their analysis of how Muslim identities and discourses are constructed and resisted online, Mohammed Al-Nawawi and Sahar Khamis describe how the internet fosters cohesion between the global ummah and individuals, while simultaneously facilitating ijtihad, or efforts of independent reasoning. Applying examples of Quranic recitation and listening to sermons, the author suggests that visitors to Islamic websites can independently mark when a ritual begins and ends without needing to adhere to limitations set by congregational participation at a physical mosque. The recent proliferation of websites that host online sermons and religious classes presents a meaningful avenue for Islamic learning and identity formation, particularly for those with whom the trend of being unmosqued resonates. In their study of podcasts as a tool for expressing Muslim identities online, Jan Schultz and colleagues describe how normative religious authority is constructed, deconstructed, and legitimized in the context of four podcasts, namely the Zaytuna Institute Knowledge Resource, Mecca One Media, Ahmadiyya Online, and Alt.Muslim Review. As sound recordings of sermons, speeches, music, and other religious content representing a range of styles and distributed through websites and portals, these podcasts offer advice to listeners and can be used for dawah, for reinforcing existing power structures, for managing communal and individual crises, generating networks, and facilitating open dialogue. Other social scientists have alluded to aspects of listening for the purposes of learning and presenting religious values and rhetorical patterns in their research on Muslim conversion in both Europe and North America. Kate Sidbiri's interviews with British Muslim converts revealed that listening to devotional tapes and CDs and to trusted friends, acquaintances, imams, and scholars for guidance in finding the information required to express moral and religious beliefs were widespread practices. Another study by Ali Coase similarly observed that verbal communication was a critical element for native British Muslim converts to develop their sense of religious identity, particularly learning how to pray in Arabic and invoking an authentic religious vocabulary. As reflected in research on female Muslim converts in the Netherlands, formal communication, informal conversations, and listening to others' conversion narratives mediate experiences of embracing Islam. Although these studies are not primarily focused on listening, they offer a useful foundation for examining listening as a practice that contributes to learning about Islam and what it means to be Muslim. Okay, so moving on to my key research questions here, which sort of guide the discussion today. I wanted to say that media, policy, and public discourse across both Europe and North America has cast Muslims as a security threat, which perpetuates negative stereotypes about both Islam more broadly and its adherents. In response to this political climate that we're working in, my research strives to draw attention to the lived experiences of Muslim converts in the Toronto area and the diversity that characterizes them. More specifically, I focus on the informational factors that mediate a person's decision to convert, their conversion experience overall, and the ways in which converts come to know what it means to be Muslim in the Toronto area. And so these two questions primarily guide my research. So what strategies and actions do Muslim converts employ to seek, evaluate, and share information that is salient to their experiences? And secondly, how do these practices help converts to develop and present their identities? So just to review a few key terms before moving on. By information, I refer to any textual, visual, sensory, or social resources that help a person navigate and understand his or her world. I use information practice as an alternative to information behavior, which is a field of study within library and information science based on a tradition of more cognitive approaches to researching information needs and seeking activities. Influenced by Pierre Bourdieu's idea of habitus, proponents of information practice describe the concept as socially constructed, continuous, habitual actions and strategies to manage information in their lives. Since conversion to Islam often involves community participation, information practice lends itself to studying this phenomenon. While I acknowledge that the following terms are contested, I worked with the following operational definitions of key concepts for the purposes of my research. Religious identity is defined as the distinguishable style or expression of a person's religious affiliation and spiritual values, which can be recognized by others through a person's actions, rhetorical practices and preferences, and through the ways that others relate and respond to them. And this includes things like social exclusion, advice about religious customs, and proselytization efforts. I also assert that religious identity has become destabilized in the context of globalization, as geographic and cultural boundaries become blurred through migration and networked communication. Muslim converts in my research refers to persons who previously self-identified as non-religious or as adherents of another faith tradition and re-examine personal frameworks to become Muslim. Since socioeconomic and political conditions shape multiple interpretations of Islam, Muslim is an inclusive adjective to describe one who accepts Islam as one's religion. So very broad and inclusive term in that sense. So my dissertation research applies interpretive ethnography to produce a detailed description and analysis of how participants seek, evaluate, and share information that is significant to their conversion experiences from their own perspectives. I've combined semi-structured narrative interviews and participant observation at local educational and convert care organizations, as well as timeline drawings to document participants' discursive practices and their information activities. Currently, I've held initial interviews with 11 participants, 8 women and 3 men, and follow-up interviews with 9 of them. I've also held interviews with 2 participants' spouses to understand the larger context of their conversions. Additionally, I've attended a combination of annual conventions, weekly discussion groups, and religious education classes hosted and facilitated by local mosques and spiritual care organizations. And this summer, I hope to analyze the data that I've generated over the last 12 months of fieldwork and then write up findings from this analysis. So by conceptualizing listening as a socially constructed action to make sense of information and retain knowledge, it can be considered as an information practice. In what follows, I'll highlight examples from my current research to argue that Muslim converts' auditory participation in new media plays a critical role in how they learn about Islam and negotiate their religious identities. As Amy Duragatis suggests, sound invites us to think more expansively about where religion happens and to move beyond traditional religious institutions. Like Duragatis, my research intends to raise awareness about the variety of acoustic and other media, global networks, and diverse perspectives that shape experiences of converting to Islam in contemporary North America. So over the past 12 months, beginning with a pilot study of 4 participants, one aspect of listening that has been reflected in the experiences shared by many of the participants in my research is engaging with lectures posted on YouTube and made available as podcasts. Prior to weekly classes and discussion groups that I've attended, facilitators frequently send reminders to attendees via email or Facebook and Twitter posts about the availability of recordings of the previous classes on SoundCloud, which is an audio platform that hosts originally created recordings and fosters audio content sharing among its users. This practice seems to suggest that listening to lectures is important for spiritual development, even if people cannot be physically present to attend Friday prayer, classes, or other events. It may also reflect a generational shift or a trend towards just-in-time lectures that can be accessed at any time of day or night, paused when the listener gets interrupted or wishes to switch to other activities, and reviewed or revisited when needed. Rather than being characterized as a passive act, listening can be considered an active practice, particularly in instances of engagement with online recordings. At the same time, some scholars have articulated tensions between traditional ways of learning and social media. For example, one presenter at a conference I attended, one of the largest Islamic conventions held in North America, addressed the perils of social media, specifically their negative impact on health and links to obesity, cyberbullying, and how social media deprives us of the ability to think deep thoughts and have meaningful interactions, instead setting up an illusion that communication is taking place. This scholar emphasized how information is giving out while communication is taking from, and that part of what makes us human is our ability to communicate with others close to us. For this particular speaker, the ability to understand one another cannot be fostered through social media. Rather, mutual understanding is achieved through deep and meaningful conversations. One participant, Saif, described the valuable knowledge gained through listening to lectures by Islamic scholars on YouTube and on television, while also cautioning against what he called Islam by Google. As he explained, from a point of total ignorance to a point of acceptance, there were definitely things I wanted to clear up that I didn't deliberately try to clear up, but I came into contact with information that ended up clearing things up because I paid a lot of attention to what the Muslim scholars were saying about world issues. And by extension, if you listen to them for a long period of time, they might be talking about their religion itself. And some of them were just cool to listen to, he says. Like some of them are really, some of these scholars, Hamza Yusuf for example, classically trained, very charismatic. For this individual, although he recognizes it can be misguided to obtain information about Islam uncritically from the internet, online lectures provide a fruitful tool for listening to scholars' perspectives on various issues and clarifying his own stance on world affairs. Others praised online lectures and du'as for their capacity for spiritual development. For instance, January, this is a name selected by my participant, shared the following anecdote about an event she attended at which the group listened to a dua recited in a YouTube video, and the inspiration she derives from her Muslim friends. So I included a quotation here. She says, "And the Muslims that I have within my personal networks, they inspire me a lot, and they help me pray, enrich my religious practice and identity so much when they tell me about even their practices. And it's even like, okay, we go do this together, like when we went to the Shia thing. Well, it turned out we were sat in front of a YouTube video, which was a dua, and basically you watch the dua, you hear someone recite it, the prayer, so you have someone recite the dua, and then you see it written in Arabic, then you see the English translation underneath, and it's all recited in Arabic. So we're sitting in front of this video for 31 minutes, and I followed, I was very interested. It was a little more than it wasn't really what I had in mind, but we had a very nice conversation afterwards, which again lasted for like 2 hours, right? I was having this conversation about identity and stuff, and because my friend's really into this, it was kind of cool. And it might sound crazy, but I might go back again, because I did enjoy it. And I mean the dua itself, like I wouldn't say I get behind everything, but it was very beautiful. Similar to this person, January, Hermione, another participant selected name, highlighted the central role that her friends played in sharing online lectures and podcasts. In her words, I became closer with some of the other Muslim girls that I hadn't really got to know in my first and second year of university. I became more friends with them, and they were showing me different kinds of resources I could use, like different books they were reading, and they knew a lot of good resources on the internet. So good lectures on YouTube, whatever, websites that were reliable, that kind of stuff. So they would send those to me or share them on Facebook, and I would learn from that. Alexandra also mentioned that the online lectures she listens to are often recommended by friends, and that she has a genuine preference in listening to such lectures over other media. It's not just like, oh, you know, I'm so pious and religious, I want to listen to a lecture and I totally don't listen to music or any other, you know, newscasts or YouTube videos. No, it's a genuine interest. Listening to online lectures in particular helps Alexandra to learn more about Islam and develop her identity, since transportation to in-person classes is always feasible. As she explained, most of them I'm still just going on the internet, listening to lectures online, because I can't go to a suburban city outside Toronto. It's practically, she says, another suburb even further away. So on the one hand, you feel, first of all, people move from an eastern Canadian city to Toronto, there's so much more Muslims here, my life is perfect. But then you realize that, in the end of the day, what's your daily interactions again with these sources of information? Most of it, again, is online. So it doesn't really matter where you are, just as, you know, what are you aware of, and what are you not aware of? And it has entirely to do with who your friends are, and not really who you interact with in daily life. For those who weren't able to attend in-person lectures and classes more regularly, they had access to supplementary modes of communication and pedagogical techniques, such as visual aids or interactive dialogue. Meanwhile, the active listening remains an essential component of such educational offerings. 2 conventions that I attended in different parts of the GTA and with substantial variation in the number of attendees were primarily structured around lectures and presentations. 2 participants, Aisha and Kelly, spoke favorably about listening to scholars at classes offered through large Islamic educational organizations. Kelly described her listening to scholars at these classes and how that helped to contextualize Quranic Arabic verses. In her words, when I go to these classes and I hear about the context of when this particular verse was revealed, it makes perfect sense to me. And then that's where I find a lot of logic in it. So I've been really happy with the classes so far. Really, really comforted. Really at peace with it. Learning one day at a time. While Kelly discussed feeling comforted by the factual responses she heard from scholars at these classes, Aisha seemed to take a more critical approach to listening to such lectures. She expressed how she valued talking to someone I know is really properly studied. And you can tell when they have because they never speak definitely, like this is the way that it is. And when people start talking that way, I just stop listening. Because it's not, and they always talk about Islam being the religion of ease, and there's a lot of gray areas, and that's given to people to practice the faith. Despite the advantages that in-person classes provide, so for example, the direct interaction with these scholars, whether through listening, Aisha noted a paucity of what she referred to as teaching methodologies among many of the lectures she encountered. Instead of demonstrating pedagogical training, she said that classes tend to be lecture style. Additionally, Hermione shared her need for more stability in learning and her aspiration for deeper religious knowledge. As she says, I don't think there's any particular thing I want to learn, but there's a particular atmosphere of learning that I'm looking for. I guess I'm envisioning kind of like a patient, slow kind of space where knowledge is kind of unfolding and it's not just like slapped in your face. Take it as it is. I want a more active learning process. Like when I went to this retreat with a lot of scholars there, all I could think of was, I wish I could dedicate my time to become an Islamic scholar. Like I would love to learn more in depth about a lot of things. Although Hermione did not explicitly use the term in her discussion about her vision for a learning environment, listening seems to lend itself to a more patient process of spiritual learning and identity formation. And finally, spoken word poetry is an additional acoustic mode of religious expression and reflection. While spoken word poetry is certainly not universally enjoyed, it is often a prominent part of Muslim conventions as an acceptable form of entertainment. Arguably, contemporary spoken word poetry continues from traditional methods of religious teaching and learning, which emphasized intentional listening to speakers and attention to style and rhythm. The examples I've shared are not mutually exclusive. In fact, many participants acknowledge that online lectures, podcasts, and multimodal classes have been informative and inspiring at different times and places and may overlap with one another. For instance, podcasts can offer a useful alternative when scheduling constraints prevent attendance at in-person classes, and lectures that include visual elements or discussion can deepen understanding about concepts covered in podcasts or sermons alone.